The development of the atomic bombs in the United States began when Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was President of the United States at the time. Einstein had escaped from Germany and fled to America. In his letter, he made Roosevelt aware of the potential destructive power of a nuclear weapon that supposedly Nazi scientists had been working on. Einstein was urging Roosevelt to begin the development of the weapon and to do it quickly before Adolf Hitler was able to do so. The development of this weapon became known as the Manhattan Project. The project was assigned to a group of scientists led by J. Robert Oppenheimer to begin the creation of the weapon. Roosevelt unfortunately was never able to see the conclusion of the project as he had died before it was complete. When he died, Harry S. Truman became President of the United States, and that is when he had become aware of the top-secret project. At this point, the project was so close to completion, and within 4 months of his presidency, Truman had made the decision to drop the bombs on Japan and end the war. Bombs that were dropped on Japan are known as weapons of mass destruction because of their intense amount of destructive power. Nuclear weapons set off massive explosions followed by a large cloud of poisonous radiation. These weapons are different than conventional weapons as conventional bombs derive their energy from the burning of chemical compounds, while atomic bombs get their energy through the process of nuclear fission, which is the splitting of a nucleus of a highly volatile plutonium or uranium atom. Such a reaction releases more than 10 times the energy of a typical chemical reaction. The atomic bomb is significantly more powerful than a conventional bomb, and the effects on Japan show just that. The effects of the nuclear weapon go far beyond the initial blast, which sets it apart from the conventional weapon as well. The explosion of a nuclear bomb creates a huge fireball and a giant mushroom-shaped cloud, both of which release deadly radiation that spreads over an area far greater than the explosion itself. Understanding the comparison between a conventional bomb and a nuclear weapon helps to understand why the bombs were so destructive. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the lead scientist on the project, wrote a letter to General Farrell explaining the precautions that needed to be taken with the bombs. During the detonation, radiations are emitted which are expected to be injurious within a radius of a mile and lethal within a radius of 0.6 of a mile. He also explains that the effects will not just be a part of the initial blast and that the radiation will rise to a considerable height above where the bomb was dropped and remain there as a compact cloud for hours after the bomb was detonated. Oppenheimer also makes Farrell aware that the plane that is dropping the bomb has to remain a specific distance away from the blast in order to avoid the radiation. There was another precaution that was put into effect on the decision of dropping the bomb. The bomb was ready on July 29, 1945, but with the forecast it was delayed until August 6th, and then the takeoff time was set and finalized. The target was Hiroshima. One reason was because it was the only place where there was no indication of a prisoner of war camp, and this is important because it meant that there was no possibility of an American being affected by the results of the bomb. It was necessary to take the precautions when working with the bomb and protecting the effects of the bomb before they were ready to detonate it. There was more than one reason why Truman decided to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Many historians believe that the main reason he had dropped the bombs was because he was looking in the best interest for the American troops. Truman knew that with a land invasion of Japan, the Japanese would fight back hard, which would result in the loss of American lives. Iwo Jima was a perfect example of Truman's logic in this decision because even though the island was significantly small, the fighting was hard and intense and the casualties were extremely high. Truman knew that he would not be able to face the mother of an American soldier and explain why he had sent the troops into battle when he had a weapon that could have saved her son's life. This is why the decision was relatively easy for Truman. Along with the high amount of casualties, Truman knew that the Japanese did not easily surrender, and Iwo Jima had been a demonstration of that as well. They had the mentality that they would rather die than surrender, so they fought to their death in the defense of their country. Invading Japan could have possibly extended the war until 1947 or 1948, and who knew if the Americans could have been able to last that long. He would rather not put the troops in the face of more danger. Truman's use of the bomb, viewed in the context of the long and terrible war, should be seen as his choosing of the lesser evils available to him. After the bombs had been dropped, "We have used it," Truman said of the new weapon, in order to shorten the agony of the war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. Japan has a unique geography, and he knew that there was really only one way he would be able to invade. A study showed that if Americans had invaded, there would have been as many as 1 million casualties. On July 26, 1945, Truman, along with the Allies, created the Potsdam Proclamation, which was the final ultimatum for Japan's surrender, and Truman warned Japan of an atomic attack. Truman called upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese ignored the request and were prepared to fight back with full force, including all civilians in the army. Since the Japanese had not surrendered, Truman went ahead with the dropping of the bombs. Historians have different ideas on the motives that drew Truman to dropping the bombs. It was believed that Truman dropped the bombs to show the world, but mostly Russia, the power of the United States. This idea became even more believable with the discovery of Truman's diary letter, which revealed anti-Soviet motives. The bomb was dropped to provide a combat demonstration of the bomb in order to convince the Russians to accept American plan for stable peace. It was believed that Truman wanted to achieve atomic diplomacy with the Soviet Union because before the bombs were dropped, the United States had asked the Soviets for help in invading Japan. Even though the Japanese most likely would have surrendered with the land invasion rather than dropping the bombs, it would have taken a lot longer, and Truman did not want the Soviets to be able to partake in the credit in the victory of the Pacific. This way, the United States would be able to claim victory before the Soviets were even involved. It is commonly said that the dropping of the bombs was not in fact the last act in World War II, but the first act in the Cold War. While Truman was negotiating for the help of the Soviets to force Japan's surrender, Truman had brought up the development of the nuclear weapon, and the main reason why the Soviets had agreed to help was because they were expecting the use of that weapon. After Truman had mentioned and explained the bomb's capabilities of destruction, it would be extremely difficult for him to avoid using it. Also, $2 billion tax dollars had been spent on the creation of the bombs. If Truman had not used them, it would be a huge loss of money, and many questions would be raised as to why, after so much money was spent and so many American lives were lost in an invasion. Controversy had been developed with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A major question that arose was why Truman had dropped the bombs so soon, but also why he had felt the need to drop 2 bombs instead of 1. The controversy in question started rising right after the bombs were dropped, as it was the beginning of the nuclear age. In 1960, when the accessibility to primary sources increased, the debate went into even more depth. It can be argued that there was no military reason for the bomb to be dropped on August 6th, as the Japanese are already in a weak state. Japan had already been feeling this pressure to surrender before the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima with the conventional bombing and naval blockade. Especially with the American help from the Soviets that was being planned, the Japanese knew they would face much more distress if they didn't surrender. Even though this was all true, the Japanese had no intent of surrendering, and they were preparing for the entire Japanese civilization to put up a fight. They had the mentality that they would rather die than surrender, so this is why the atomic bombs were necessary sooner or later. Along with that, questions arose as to why the second bomb was dropped when the first one had already created an enormous amount of destructive power. There are technical differences between the 2 bombs. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Little Boy, was a uranium bomb, while Fat Man, who was dropped at Nagasaki, was a plutonium bomb. It was questioned if using the 2 different bombs was only an experiment in order to test and compare the different effects. The dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki was not to compare the difference between the 2 bombs, but it is commonly seen that the second bomb was unnecessary. It is thought that the Japanese did not have enough time in between when the first bomb was dropped to when the second one was to make a decision. It was believed that if the Japanese would have surrendered without the dropping of the second bomb. On the other hand, the second bomb was dropped to show the Japanese that 1 bomb wasn't all the Americans had had. It is possible that if only 1 bomb was dropped, that the Japanese might have thought that it was all they had, and they continued to put up a fight. Those who justify the use of the Hiroshima atomic bomb as a military necessity find it difficult to ascribe the same motivation to the Nagasaki bomb. 85% of Americans that were surveyed had said that they had supported the dropping of both atomic bombs. Only 10% of Americans did not approve, where the remaining 5% had no opinion on the topic. Many Americans had taken pride in the amazing scientific achievement of the bombs that it helped to minimize the objections. Even though the bombs had harmed many civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most Americans were happy that the bombs had ended the war. Americans had faced many hardships like the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March throughout the war, so most Americans were just glad that the bloody war was over. Following the end of World War II, Americans had occupied Japan for a number of years to help them rebuild. The United States had made a great contribution by helping them to rebuild their government, economics, education, and military. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan was a significant point in American history as To this day, it still remains as the only nuclear attack used for warfare.